Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at New Testament manuscripts in our continuing study of the biblical languages. We've already noted how that there are three major branches when we look at the New Testament, the Greek New Testament text, the Byzantine, the Western, and the Alexandrian. We noted how these have three geographical divisions, the Western and the Western Mediterranean, the Byzantine around Constantinople, and the Alexandrian texts based around Egypt. My old Hebrew, actually, he was my Hebrew exegesis professor, but he was also the author of Inspiration and Canonicity of the Bible. And it's in this regard, Dr. Lard Harris, said, it thus develops that we do not have an embarrassing welter of 3,000 manuscripts. When he wrote that, there were only 3,000. Actually, we found more than 5,000 now. But notice he says disagreeing in confusing ways, but that these manuscripts have been copied with considerable care from a few old and standard editions. And what he said back then, and he first wrote these words back in, I think it was the 1970s, but what he said back then still holds true today, even though we've discovered a lot more. It was along these general patterns. Now we're ready to look at some of the actual manuscripts, and we're going to look at only maybe the most famous or infamous. I'm going to begin with the Codex Alexandrinus. It's called this because it has come, from that Egyptian family, from that Alexandrian family, written around 450 A.D. Notice this is a copy of the New Testament, written very precisely. Look at the columns that you see in the back, and then I've zoomed in on, and this just happens to be John chapter 1, verse 1. You can actually read in arche and logos. In the beginning was the Word, and it goes on from there. Notice it's all capital letters. That's the way they wrote at that period. It contains both the New Testament, but also the Septuagint. That is the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures. It had been kept in Alexandria, Egypt, but then the Patriarch of Constantinople, and remember that the Patriarch had been in charge of these things, even though Alexandria and Egypt had become Muslim, he still had charge of the churches that were there. There still were churches, Christian churches. In fact, there's still Christian churches in both Alexandria as well as in Cairo. And he presented this manuscript to England as a gift in the year 1627, which was unfortunately just about 15 years too late for it to be considered as they were translating the King James Version. It's interesting to speculate what might have happened if, instead of giving it in 1627, if maybe 50 years earlier that gift had been given. Our King James Version might look considerably different. Be that as it may, it's a very old, and it's not the oldest, but it's a very old manuscript and very valuable in that regard. And notice, very carefully structured. This was not just thrown together by amateurs. This was put together by professional scribes who were attempting to do a very thorough job. Next, we look at the Codex Vaticanus, also known as Codex B. Codex Alexandrinus is known as Codex A. The codexes have been labeled for library purposes. This is also a very professional-looking manuscript. Notice how it's set in three columns instead of two. It contains also the Septuagint and the New Testament, dated to a little bit earlier, around 350 A.D. So this is now, both these dates, notice, are in the period when Christianity had been legalized and was now getting government support. And so these manuscripts might actually have been funded by monies that were taken from the Roman government, because the Roman emperors, starting with Constantine, had now declared themselves to be Christians, and so they were funding perhaps these sorts of manuscript copies. It happens to be missing about 71 pages. Napoleon took the Vatican Library in 1809. He relocated it to Paris, and in the relocation, scholars suddenly had access to manuscripts that they might have heard about, but weren't, hadn't been able to study because the Vatican's, it doesn't open up their library to everybody. And so now this manuscript became sort of public knowledge. Now, the Codex was returned when Napoleon fell, Battle of Waterloo. The Codex was returned to the Vatican in 1815. There it remained. It was allowed to be studied in Samuel Trugellus. He was a Protestant scholar. Actually, he was from a denominational group that I used to belong in my younger years, the Plymouth Brethren. Didn't necessarily hold with all of what eventually became the Plymouth Brethren theology, and that's probably a good thing. But he was permitted to examine the manuscript in 1845, and then the entire manuscript was photographed and published in 1890 and made available to scholars around the world. Next, we look at the Ephraemi Rescriptus. Now, a rescriptus means that it's been rewritten, and the backstory on this is that there was a early church father going back to the 300s from Syria, Father Ephraim the Syrian, and he had a number of sermons, and these were Greek translations. Since he was from Syria, he probably gave the sermons, if I'm going to guess here, probably in Aramaic, but then they had been translated into Greek. And subsequently, many hundreds of years later, in the 12th century, somebody wanted to copy these sermons, but they didn't have any writing materials because papyri was hard to come by, and parchment is rather expensive because anytime you get a page of parchment, that's going to take the death of an animal. You have to take an animal and kill the animal and scrape the hide, and that gives you 2 pages of parchment. And so instead, they took a very old copy of the New Testament and used a knife to scrape off the ink, and then reuse. This is recycling at its best, I suppose, or at its worst. They recycled this codex that had formerly been a New Testament codex to put in these sermons. You can imagine his surprise when a Protestant pastor by the name of Pierre Alix noticed he was actually reading the sermons, and he noticed when he held it up to the light and sort of the light shone on it just right, that there was other writing underneath the sermons, and so that's called a palimpsest. The idea of writing that takes place over other writing, and of course the older writing was a New Testament text, and a very, very old New Testament text. And this wasn't discovered until about the 1600s. When they studied it, and they were able to very carefully, it was very painstakingly trying to determine what the original Greek text read underneath these sermons. The Greek text was dated to the early 5th century. That was a very old Greek manuscript of the New Testament that had been scraped off. And it contains some of the Septuagint, but most of the surviving pages are from the New Testament. Now, it contains the long ending of Mark. We're going to see I mentioned the Sinaiticus. No, I haven't mentioned the Sinaiticus. I mentioned the Vaticanus and the Alexandrinus. And some of those manuscripts don't. When you get to Mark chapter 16, we already noted in an earlier class, that passage is not found in some of those older manuscripts. It was found here in the Ephraemi Rescriptus. We're going to see some places where it is found. Here's a copy, a photograph of it, and you can see both there's writing, but then there's very faint writing behind it. And nowadays with computer and ultraviolet light, and I'm not sure all the things that they use, but they're able to now get the complete Greek text. They were able to get a lot of it before the invention of these things, but now anything that was smudged now is readily visible as they can read and consult the Ephraemi Rescriptus. Next, we look at the Codex Sinaiticus. I started to mention that before by mistake, named after Mount Sinai, where it was discovered. There was a Count Constantine von Tischendorf, and he was actually traveling looking for different manuscripts. So this wasn't just a chance occurrence, but he happened to visit St. Catherine's Monastery. It's located. Let's look at a picture of that. Here is the traditional site of Mount Sinai. I'm not saying for sure that's where Mount Sinai was, but for many, many hundreds, actually over 1,000 years, people have been pointing to that as the site. So it has some historical tradition behind it, whether it is or not. And if you look to the left of our picture, down at the base, you can see it almost looks like a little smudge, but that's actually the monastery. Let's look at that from a different angle, and you can see the monastery here. I'm actually, I took this picture. I was coming down from the mountain from Mount Sinai. I'd been up to the top and coming down just as the sun came out and snapped this photo of the monastery. It is still functioning as a monastery today. Paula was with me. I took this picture noticing the stairway here. Notice the Greek letters, which reminds us of the Greek culture. This is Orthodox. Actually, I'm not sure of the monks there. Are they Eastern Orthodox? Are they Russian Orthodox? They are Orthodox in that tradition, in that Eastern tradition. But I noticed Jacobos, the sigma at the bottom stairway that I cut that off by mistake. But that's the name, either Jacob or James. They're actually in Greek the same name. I just found the picture interesting. So the monastery's been there for over 1,000 years, and he was in the monastery. It was rather cold one night. In fact, when I was there, I was there in March or April, sometime around there. I remember getting to the top of Mount Sinai, and I was wearing a T-shirt, and over that was a sweatshirt, and over that was a black jacket and a hat. And I was thinking, I forgot to bring gloves because it was freezing up there. It gets very cold in the desert. Well, it was cold at the monastery, and the way Tischendorf tells the story, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but this is the way he told it. They were cold, and they were gathered around the fireplace with some of the monks, and he noticed a basket of what they were using for kindling, and that it was filled with these old pieces of parchment. And he looked, and there was writing upon them, and lo and behold, it was copies of the Bible, written in Greek. And he got real excited, and he wanted to take those. He says initially 129 pages were discovered. Now, let me just give you the monk side, because they were questioned about that, and I don't know, who's telling the truth. But their comment was, no, this was not. They weren't using it to light the fire. They were not burning these manuscripts. That there was a misunderstanding, a language barrier, and he misunderstood. So we'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but in any case, the pages were saved, and it had been written around 350 A.D., making it another very, very, very old copy of the scriptures. And he was permitted to take 43 pages out of the 129 that they had discovered. And so he took them away, and the entire manuscript was eventually given to Tsar Nicholas of Russia as a gift. And so it traveled to Russia. But then the USSR, remember how Russia, you had the Communist Revolution, and Russia became known as the United Soviet Socialist Republic. They went sort of a communist, became a communist country with communist heads. I'm going to call them dictators. And they had adopted an atheistic philosophy, which means they didn't really feel like they needed a copy of the Bible because they said, we don't want Bibles, we don't believe in God. And so, but what they were short of cash. And so they sold the Codex to the British Museum in 1933. This is in the days of Stalin, for 100,000 British pounds. That translates to quite a lot of money. And so it was considered by the British a very, very good deal. A forgotten room was later on discovered in 1975. It had been sort of walled up, and they were doing some renovations, and lo and behold, they pulled down a wall. There was a hidden room, and there were more ancient manuscript fragments. Now, these hadn't been cared for. They'd been sort of, forgotten in this sort of closet that had been walled over. And then another page was found in 2009. So until fairly recent times, these discoveries of parts of Codex Sinaiticus have continued to be uncovered. Now, here's the codex. Notice we've got the columns across, again, very professionally done. When we say codex, we mean that it's bound on one side, just like a book. And so that was a very valuable manuscript. Next, we look at the Oxyrhynchos Papyri. Oxyrhynchos is an area in Egypt, sort of central Egypt, south of Cairo. This dates back to an archaeological dig in the 1890s, led by Grenfell and Hunt. We're going to talk about Grenfell a little bit later. They were doing an excavation south of the Fayum oasis in Egypt. Remember that on the west side of Egypt, there were people who lived there, but that's where all the pyramids and burial places were located. And the same thing was here. They were actually excavating some areas where there had been burials. And they came across a section that was filled with stuffed crocodiles. Crocodiles that had not really been mummified, but they'd been stuffed and buried here for some reason. And the stuffing included bits of papyri that had been which had writing, and some of them included portions of the New Testament. These papyri that had New Testament sections to them. Now, another find around this time, and it's actually named for the John Rylands University where it is kept, so it's not for the discoverer. It was Grenfell, one of our archaeologists from the Oxyrhynchos Papyri, who acquired it. I'm not sure was it in a crocodile. I don't actually know how he came across this, but it's a very small piece of the Gospel of John. It dates to somewhere between 90 to 150 AD. We're not sure exactly when, but it's the oldest piece of the New Testament ever discovered, and it received the catalog number Papyri 52. The reason it's 52 is because there had been 51 papyri discovered and cataloged before this one. As I said, found in Egypt, and it consists of this single scrap. The single scrap is written on both sides, and it contains, one side has a little tiny portion from John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33. It's not the whole verses, but just a central part of those. And then you flip it over, and it's still in John 18, but now it's in verses 37 through 38, which means the fact that it's written front and back like this is telling us that that's part of a codex. That you had codexes that early in history, in the 1st and 2nd century, and because if it was a scroll, even written in front and behind, then the next verse would come much later. It would be part of a long scroll. But this was a codex. This was a book that contained the Gospel of John. We come next to the Chester Beatty Papyri, and we're not sure exactly where or how these were found. They were purchased from an antiquities dealer by an American millionaire by the name of Chester Beatty, and so his name was given over to them. They sort of purchased, we would say today, on the black market. The details of the original discovery are unknown to us. It was arranged as codexes, and there were 7 manuscripts of the Septuagint, also portions of the Book of Enoch. If you go down to the Ethiopian church, their canon looks a little bit different than ours. Now they have just like our Old Testament and our New Testament, but also they have additional books, not only the books of the Apocrypha that the Roman Catholic Church recognizes, but also some additional books even from those, including this Book of Enoch. Now, if you compare different books of Enoch, it's not just a matter where it's been translated and retranslated and changed, but actually there are places where it's actually almost a different book, a little bit like reading And I'm going to use this as an example. I don't know if this is really fair, but it's a little bit like reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which tell the same story, sometimes even with close to the same words, but there's also some major differences. And likewise with the Book of Enoch, there are there are different books of Enoch. So depending on which one you're reading, they can look very different and be even arranged differently from one from the other. The Chester Beatty Papyri also contained a number of New Testament manuscripts, and notice these have catalog numbers. These are all papyri. P45 contains portions of the Gospels and the Book of Acts. P46 contains portions of the Pauline epistles, as well as the Epistle to the Hebrews, but not the pastoral epistles. Now, that's not necessarily a reflection on that. It just happens to be how they were arranged, how they contained. And finally, P47 contains portions of the Book of Revelation, specifically chapters 9 through 17. So the central section of the Book of Revelation, the portions before and the portions after that, apparently were lost. We come to our final manuscript, and this is the Codex Bezae, or Bezae. You probably pronounce it different ways. Dates to around 400 AD, so it's a very early manuscript. It contains Greek on one page and a Latin translation on the opposite page. So sort of an ancient interlinear, although it's not the text in the same line, but on opposite pages where it has the translation. It's written on parchment, and it contains portions of the Gospels and the Book of Acts, and it represents the Western family of manuscripts. Now, I'm not saying it comprises that, but it is from that basic family. Remember, the Western manuscripts, most of them are in Latin, but this is a Greek text. So it's telling you the Latin isn't just Latin translations, although they are that, but they are testifying to a Greek source because that's the way they've been translated. Here's a copy of that, and you can see on the left, you see the Greek. Remember, it's in all capital letters in the uncials, as we call them. And then in the right, and I can sort of puzzle out some of the Greek on the left, but the right, I don't I don't read much in the way of Latin, and so I can't make that out almost at all. The manuscript contains the long ending of Mark. So both the Western and the Byzantine traditions have that long ending of Mark. Remember, after Mark chapter 16, verse 8, was not found in quite a few of the Proto-Alexandrian. It was found in at least one or two, but not in all of them. And also the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery in John chapter 8. Here's a very early manuscript that has that story in it. It came to be housed eventually. We're not sure where it had, what travels it had taken before, but in a monastery in Lyon, that's what we call France today. The ancient name was Gaul, but in the city of Lyon, it came to be here, and it was consulted during the Council of Trent in the 1500s, and also for the Stephanus Greek New Testament, which became eventually sort of a forerunner of what we call the Textus Receptus. And so it represents that branch of textual families. Notice it goes back to very early in church history. Now, it got its name from Theodore Beza. He was the pupil and successor of John Calvin in the Reformation churches, and the reformers in France were known as Huguenots. Well, they somehow got a hold of this manuscript, didn't want it to see it destroyed, or I'm not sure the Roman Catholic Church would have done that, but they took it and gave it for both for safekeeping and also so he could read it and maybe make some Greek texts. I'm not sure what use he was going to make of it, but they gave it to Beza, and that's where it gets its name from. So we call it the Codex Bezae. And he, in turn, eventually gave it to the University of Cambridge in England, I think maybe for safekeeping, because things were a little dicey on the continent with all the fighting between the reformers and the Roman Catholics, and there was just a lot going on. Whereas England had eventually taken a more moderate stance toward the Reformation, and so it would find a safe home in the University of Cambridge. And also, so it actually has two names, Codex Bezae, and it's also called the Codex Cambridge something or other. I forget the exact term, but there's an additional name that's given to it for that.